Question 1. Comparative studies suggest that financial advisors often face ethical dilemmas when clients express a strong desire for aggressive tax avoidance strategies. In such a situation, what is the most appropriate initial course of action for a financial advisor operating under UK regulations and SISI guidelines? Option A. Advise the client that aggressive tax avoidance is generally not permissible and refuse to discuss any related strategies. Option B. Conduct a thorough assessment of the client's overall financial situation, risk tolerance, and objectives to determine suitable and compliant tax efficiency strategies. Option C. Immediately propose aggressive tax avoidance schemes that promise significant reductions in tax liability, as this is what the client has explicitly requested. Option D. Focus solely on the client's stated goal of reducing tax, without delving into the legality or broader implications of the proposed methods. The correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough assessment of the client's overall financial situation, risk tolerance, and objectives to determine suitable and compliant tax efficiency strategies. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated wishes and the potential for those wishes to lead to detrimental outcomes or regulatory breaches. The advisor must navigate the client's desire for aggressive tax avoidance with their fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, which includes ensuring compliance with tax laws and avoiding undue risk. The advisor's judgment is critical in balancing client autonomy with professional responsibility. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing a thorough understanding of the client's financial situation and risk tolerance before offering advice. This aligns with the principles of client care and suitability, which are fundamental in financial advisory regulations. Specifically, it upholds the regulatory requirement to provide advice that is appropriate to the client's circumstances, ensuring that any proposed strategies are not only legally compliant, but also aligned with the client's overall financial objectives and capacity for risk. This proactive due diligence prevents the advisor from recommending unsuitable or potentially non-compliant strategies. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach fails by immediately proposing aggressive tax avoidance strategies without adequate client assessment. This violates the regulatory obligation to understand the client's needs, objectives, and risk profile. It risks recommending strategies that are unsuitable, overly aggressive, and could lead to penalties or legal challenges for the client, thereby breaching the duty of care. Another incorrect approach, by focusing solely on the client's stated desire for tax reduction without considering the legality or broader implications, ignores the advisor's responsibility to ensure compliance with tax legislation. This can lead to the client engaging in activities that are non-compliant, resulting in significant financial penalties and reputational damage, and constitutes a failure in professional conduct and regulatory adherence. A further incorrect approach, by dismissing the client's request outright without exploring legitimate avenues for tax efficiency, may fail to meet the client's reasonable expectations and could be seen as a lack of diligence in exploring all appropriate options. While avoiding aggressive strategies is important, a complete refusal without investigation might not represent the best professional service if there are compliant methods to achieve some of the client's goals. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with comprehensive client discovery. This involves understanding their financial situation, objectives, risk tolerance, and any specific concerns, such as tax liabilities. Following discovery, the professional should research and evaluate potential strategies, ensuring they are compliant with all relevant regulations and ethical standards. The next step is to present a range of suitable options to the client, clearly explaining the benefits, risks, and regulatory implications of each. The final decision should be a collaborative one, with the client making an informed choice based on the professional's guidance. This process ensures that advice is tailored, compliant, and in the client's best interest. Question 2. The assessment process reveals that a client, Mr. Smith, has approached an investment firm requesting to invest a significant portion of his savings into a highly speculative, high-risk cryptocurrency fund. Mr. Smith explicitly states that he is aware of the risks but is chasing a quick profit and has heard about substantial gains from this particular fund. The firm's compliance department has flagged this as a potential concern due to the fund's volatility and the client's limited investment experience, which was briefly noted in an initial onboarding form. What is the most appropriate course of action for the investment advisor? Option A. Recommend a less volatile, more diversified portfolio that the advisor believes is more appropriate, regardless of Mr. Smith's specific request. Option B. Inform Mr. Smith that the firm cannot facilitate this type of investment due to its high-risk nature and suggest he seek advice elsewhere. Option C. Proceed with the investment as requested by Mr. Smith, as his instructions are clear and he has acknowledged the risks. Option D. Conduct a detailed fact-find to assess Mr. Smith's true risk tolerance, financial capacity, investment objectives, and knowledge of investments, and then determine if the requested investment is suitable. Correct answer is D. Conduct a detailed fact-find to assess Mr. Smith's true risk tolerance, financial capacity, investment objectives, and knowledge of investments, and then determine if the requested investment is suitable. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in financial advisory where a client's stated investment objectives may not align with their actual risk tolerance or financial capacity. The professional must navigate the client's expressed desires against the backdrop of regulatory obligations to ensure suitability and prevent misrepresentation. The challenge lies in balancing client autonomy with the fiduciary duty to act in their best interest, particularly when the client's request could lead to detrimental outcomes. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing a thorough understanding of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives before recommending any product. This aligns with regulatory requirements such as those found in the FCA's Conduct of Business Sourcebook, COBS, specifically COBS 9, which mandates that firms must ensure that any investment advice or product recommendation is suitable for the client. This involves gathering sufficient information about the client's knowledge and experience, financial situation, and investment objectives. By conducting a comprehensive fact-find and suitability assessment, the advisor fulfills their duty to act honestly, fairly, and professionally in accordance with the best interests of the client, as stipulated by FCA principles. Incorrect approach is analysis. Recommending the product immediately based solely on the client's stated desire, without a suitability assessment, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This breaches COBS 9 requirements and the FCA's principles for businesses, particularly Principle 6, Customers' Interests, and Principle 8, Customers' Communication. It exposes the client to undue risk and the firm to potential regulatory sanctions and reputational damage. Suggesting a product that is clearly unsuitable, even if the client insists, is also a failure. While client demands are important, they do not override the professional's obligation to ensure suitability. This approach disregards the professional's duty of care and could lead to the client suffering financial loss, which is a direct contravention of regulatory expectations. Focusing only on the potential commission without considering the client's best interests is a severe ethical breach and a violation of regulatory principles. This prioritizes the firm's or individual's financial gain over the client's welfare, undermining trust and the integrity of the financial services industry. It directly contravenes the spirit and letter of regulations designed to protect consumers. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with a comprehensive client discovery phase. This involves active listening, probing questions, and documentation of the client's financial circumstances, investment knowledge, experience, risk tolerance, and specific objectives. Following this, a thorough suitability assessment must be conducted, mapping the client's profile against available products and services. If a client's request conflicts with the suitability assessment, the professional must clearly explain the risks and reasons for unsuitability, offering alternative solutions that better align with the client's best interests. This process ensures compliance, ethical conduct, and builds long-term client relationships based on trust and competence. Question 3. To address the challenge of a client requesting a specific investment strategy that appears to carry a higher risk profile than their stated financial situation and risk tolerance might suggest, what is the most appropriate professional course of action? Option A. Proceed with the requested investment strategy, focusing primarily on its potential for higher returns, and inform the client of the associated risks in a general manner. Option B. Immediately execute the client's requested investment strategy to demonstrate responsiveness to their instructions. Option C. Decline to offer the requested investment strategy and suggest a much more conservative approach without further discussion. Option D. Conduct a thorough fact-find to understand the client's complete financial picture, investment objectives, and risk tolerance, and then discuss how the requested strategy aligns with these factors, offering alternative suitable options if necessary. Correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough fact-find to understand the client's complete financial picture, investment objectives, and risk tolerance, and then discuss how the requested strategy aligns with these factors, offering alternative suitable options if necessary. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate conflicting client instructions and regulatory obligations. The client's desire for a specific investment strategy, which may carry higher risks, must be balanced against the firm's duty to act in the client's best interest and adhere to regulatory requirements regarding suitability and risk disclosure. The challenge lies in ensuring that any recommendation or action taken is both compliant with regulations and genuinely aligned with the client's stated objectives and risk tolerance, even if those objectives appear to be at odds with prudent investment principles. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough understanding of the client's financial situation, investment objectives, and risk tolerance before making any recommendations. This aligns directly with regulatory frameworks that mandate suitability obligations. Specifically, under the Target Hiring Assessment Test's presumed regulatory jurisdiction, which emphasizes client protection and fair dealing, a professional must conduct a comprehensive fact-find. This ensures that any proposed investment is appropriate for the client's circumstances, thereby fulfilling the duty to act in the client's best interest and avoiding misrepresentation or unsuitable advice. It also allows for a discussion with the client about the risks associated with their preferred strategy and whether it truly aligns with their long-term goals. Incorrect approach is analysis, an approach that immediately proceeds with the client's requested investment without further inquiry fails to meet the suitability requirements. This constitutes a regulatory failure because it bypasses the essential step of assessing whether the investment is appropriate for the client's specific circumstances, potentially exposing the client to undue risk and violating the duty to act in their best interest. Ethically, it prioritizes client instruction over client well-being, an approach that dismisses the client's request outright without understanding the underlying motivations or exploring alternatives is also professionally deficient. While caution is necessary, a complete disregard for client input can lead to a breakdown in the professional relationship and may not be the most effective way to guide the client towards suitable investments. It can be seen as a failure to engage constructively with the client's stated needs, even if those needs require careful management. An approach that focuses solely on the potential for higher returns without adequately assessing the associated risks and the client's capacity to bear them is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a potential disregard for the client's financial well-being, prioritizing a specific outcome over a balanced and appropriate recommendation. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with a comprehensive client assessment. This involves actively listening to the client's objectives, understanding their financial situation, and gauging their risk tolerance. Following this, professionals must evaluate potential investment strategies against these parameters, ensuring regulatory compliance and ethical considerations are paramount. If a client's request appears misaligned with their profile or regulatory guidelines, the professional's duty is to educate the client, explain the risks and benefits of various options, and guide them towards a suitable course of action, rather than blindly following instructions or dismissing their input. Question 4. The evaluation methodology shows that a client has expressed a strong preference for a particular type of investment product that appears to carry a higher risk profile than typically recommended for their stated financial goals and risk tolerance. The advisor has conducted an initial assessment, but has not yet fully explored the client's understanding of the product's complexities or the potential consequences of their preference. Which of the following represents the most appropriate next step for the advisor? Option A. Proceed with implementing the client's preferred investment product immediately, as client instructions are paramount and should be followed without deviation. Option B. Advise the client that their preferred product is unsuitable and refuse to consider it, recommending a completely different investment strategy without further discussion. Option C. Focus solely on the potential upside of the client's preferred product to encourage their investment, deferring any discussion of risks until after the investment is made. Option D. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand the reasons behind their preference, explain the associated risks and potential downsides of the product, and explore alternative investments that may better align with their overall financial objectives and risk tolerance. The correct answer is D. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand the reasons behind their preference, explain the associated risks and potential downsides of the product, and explore alternative investments that may better align with their overall financial objectives and risk tolerance. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preferences and the advisor's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, particularly when those preferences might lead to suboptimal outcomes or increased risk. The advisor must navigate this delicate balance, ensuring transparency and client understanding while upholding regulatory obligations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough understanding of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives before making any recommendations. This aligns with the core principles of client-centric advice and regulatory requirements that mandate suitability and a comprehensive assessment of client needs. By engaging in a detailed discussion about the implications of the client's initial preference, the advisor demonstrates a commitment to informed decision-making and avoids potentially detrimental actions. This proactive and educational approach fosters trust and ensures that any subsequent recommendations are grounded in a solid understanding of the client's true circumstances and long-term goals, thereby fulfilling fiduciary responsibilities. An incorrect approach that solely focuses on implementing the client's initial, potentially ill-informed, preference without further inquiry would fail to meet the advisor's duty of care and suitability obligations. This could lead to investments that are not aligned with the client's risk profile or financial capacity, exposing them to undue risk or failing to meet their objectives. Such an approach would also likely violate ethical guidelines that emphasize acting in the client's best interest and providing sound, objective advice. Another incorrect approach, which involves dismissing the client's preference outright without attempting to understand the underlying reasons or educating them on alternatives, demonstrates a lack of client engagement and respect. This can damage the client relationship and may still result in unsuitable recommendations if the advisor's assumptions about the client's needs are incorrect. It fails to leverage the opportunity to guide the client towards a more informed decision. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, actively listen to and understand the client's stated preference and the rationale behind it. Second, conduct a comprehensive assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, investment knowledge, and objectives. Third, clearly explain the potential implications, risks, and benefits of the client's preferred course of action, as well as any suitable alternatives, in a manner the client can understand. Fourth, collaboratively develop an investment strategy that aligns with the client's best interests and regulatory requirements, ensuring the client provides informed consent. Question 5. The risk matrix shows a cluster of high-impact, high-likelihood operational risks related to client data security and transaction processing. The firm is considering several strategies to address these risks. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory expectations for managing such risks? Option A. Prioritizing the mitigation of low-impact, low-likelihood risks identified in other areas of the business, while deferring significant investment in the high-impact, high-likelihood client-facing risks. Option B. Outsourcing all client data management functions to a third-party vendor without conducting thorough due diligence on the vendor's security practices or establishing clear contractual obligations for data protection. Option C. Focusing on cost-saving measures by reducing the frequency of system audits and relying on existing, less robust security software to manage the identified risks. Option D. Implementing enhanced encryption protocols, conducting regular penetration testing, and establishing a dedicated incident response team with clear escalation paths to senior management and relevant regulatory bodies. Correct answer is D. Implementing enhanced encryption protocols, conducting regular penetration testing, and establishing a dedicated incident response team with clear escalation paths to senior management and relevant regulatory bodies. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the assessment of a firm's approach to managing operational risk, specifically in the context of regulatory compliance and client impact. The firm must balance the need for efficient risk mitigation with the imperative to adhere to regulatory expectations and maintain client trust. The risk matrix, a common tool for visualizing and prioritizing risks, serves as the focal point for evaluating the firm's strategic response. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it demonstrates a proactive and comprehensive understanding of regulatory obligations and their implications for client service. It prioritizes addressing high-impact, high-likelihood risks with robust controls and clear escalation procedures, aligning with the principles of sound risk management and client protection mandated by regulatory frameworks. This approach ensures that the firm not only identifies potential issues, but also implements effective strategies to prevent or mitigate them, thereby safeguarding both the firm's reputation and its clients' interests. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on cost reduction without adequately considering the potential impact on client service or regulatory breaches would be professionally unacceptable. This would represent a failure to meet the duty of care owed to clients and a disregard for regulatory requirements designed to ensure market integrity and consumer protection. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes low-impact risks over those with significant potential for client harm or regulatory noncompliance would also be a failure. This demonstrates a misallocation of resources and a lack of understanding of the firm's risk appetite and regulatory responsibilities. Such an approach could lead to significant financial penalties, reputational damage, and loss of client confidence. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the regulatory landscape and the firm's specific obligations. This involves analyzing the risk matrix not just for its quantitative data, but also for its qualitative implications, considering the potential impact on clients, market stability, and regulatory compliance. The next step is to evaluate proposed mitigation strategies against these identified risks and regulatory requirements, prioritizing those that offer the most effective and compliant solutions. Finally, continuous monitoring and review of the risk management framework are essential to adapt to evolving risks and regulatory expectations. Question 6. The risk matrix shows a potential for a conflict of interest where a financial advisor is recommending a specific investment product to a client. The advisor receives a higher commission for selling this particular product compared to other available options. Which of the following actions best upholds the advisor's professional and regulatory obligations? Option A. The advisor prioritizes recommending the product with the highest commission, as this is a standard practice in the industry and reflects the advisor's effort. Option B. The advisor recommends a different, less profitable product for the advisor, even if the higher commission product is demonstrably more suitable for the client's needs. Option C. The advisor fully discloses the commission structure and explains how the recommended product aligns with the client's stated financial goals and risk tolerance, ensuring the client understands the potential benefits and drawbacks. Option D. The advisor proceeds with the recommendation, assuming the client will benefit from the product, and only discloses the commission structure if directly asked by the client. The correct answer is C. The advisor fully discloses the commission structure and explains how the recommended product aligns with the client's stated financial goals and risk tolerance, ensuring the client understands the potential benefits and drawbacks. Explanation: the risk matrix shows a potential conflict of interest where a financial advisor is recommending a specific investment product to a client. The challenge lies in ensuring that the advisor's recommendation is solely in the client's best interest, rather than being influenced by personal gain, such as higher commission or a bonus structure tied to that product. This scenario requires careful judgment to uphold fiduciary duties and regulatory compliance. The correct approach involves a thorough disclosure of all relevant interests and a clear articulation of why the recommended product is suitable for the client's specific circumstances, risk tolerance, and financial objectives, independent of any personal benefit to the advisor. This aligns with the principles of acting honestly, with integrity, and in the best interests of the client, as mandated by regulatory frameworks governing financial advice. It demonstrates transparency and prioritizes client welfare over advisor compensation. An incorrect approach would be to fail to disclose the advisor's personal incentives for recommending the product. This constitutes a breach of transparency and potentially misleads the client, violating ethical obligations and regulatory requirements that demand full disclosure of conflicts of interest. Another incorrect approach would be to recommend the product without adequately assessing its suitability for the client's individual needs, even if disclosed. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to act in the client's best interests, which is a fundamental regulatory and ethical breach. Finally, recommending a product solely because it offers a higher commission without regard for its suitability is a clear violation of fiduciary duty and regulatory standards. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying potential conflicts of interest. They must then assess the nature and significance of these conflicts. The next step is to determine if the conflict can be managed through disclosure and client consent, or if it necessitates recusal from the decision-making process. Throughout this process, the paramount consideration must always be the client's best interests, supported by robust documentation and adherence to all applicable regulations and ethical codes. Question 7. Consider a scenario where a financial advisor, while reviewing a client's investment portfolio, notices a series of unusually large and frequent cash deposits into the client's account, followed by immediate transfers to offshore entities with no clear economic rationale. The advisor suspects these transactions may be related to money laundering or other illicit financial activities. What is the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor in this situation, adhering strictly to UK regulatory frameworks and SISI guidelines? Option A. Continue to monitor the transactions discreetly without taking any immediate action to gather more definitive proof before involving any authorities. Option B. Immediately report the suspicious activity to the National Crime Agency, NCA, through the appropriate channels, as required by anti-money laundering legislation. Option C. Report the suspicious activity internally to the firm's nominated Money Laundering Reporting Officer, MLRO, or Compliance Department, following the firm's established procedures. Option D. Inform the client directly about the suspicions and inquire about the source of the funds and the purpose of the transfers. Correct answer is B. Immediately report the suspicious activity to the National Crime Agency, NCA, through the appropriate channels, as required by anti-money laundering legislation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate conflicting ethical duties and regulatory obligations. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the duty of confidentiality owed to a client with the potential obligation to report suspected illegal activity. Misjudging this balance can lead to serious regulatory breaches, reputational damage, and potential legal repercussions for both the individual and their firm. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to the specific regulatory framework governing financial professionals, which typically mandates reporting suspicious activities while also outlining procedures for client confidentiality. This approach involves a systematic process of internal escalation and consultation with compliance or legal departments. This ensures that any reporting is done in accordance with the law and internal policies, minimizing the risk of wrongful disclosure or failure to report. It upholds the integrity of the financial system by facilitating the detection and prevention of financial crime, while also respecting client relationships where appropriate and legally permissible. An incorrect approach that involves ignoring the suspicion entirely fails to meet regulatory obligations to report suspicious activities. This can be a breach of anti-money laundering, AML, and counter-terrorist financing, CTF, regulations, which require proactive reporting of any red flags. Such inaction can have severe consequences, including fines, sanctions, and criminal charges for facilitating financial crime. Another incorrect approach, which is to immediately report the suspicion to external authorities without first consulting internal compliance or legal teams, risks violating client confidentiality unnecessarily or prematurely. While reporting may ultimately be required, the regulatory framework often dictates a specific internal process for handling such matters. Bypassing this process can lead to breaches of data protection laws and contractual obligations to clients, as well as potential disciplinary action from professional bodies. A third incorrect approach, which is to confront the client directly about the suspicion without proper authorization or a clear strategy, is highly risky. This could tip off the client, allowing them to destroy evidence or further conceal their activities, thereby hindering any investigation. It also exposes the professional to potential personal risk and could compromise the firm's ability to gather necessary information for a proper assessment and reporting. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve 1. Recognizing and documenting the suspicious activity. 2. Consulting the firm's internal policies and procedures regarding suspicious activity reporting. 3. Escalating the matter to the designated compliance or legal department for guidance and assessment. 4. Following the instructions of the compliance or legal department, which will determine the appropriate course of action, including whether and how to report to external authorities, while respecting client confidentiality as much as legally and ethically possible. Question 8. The investigation demonstrates that a financial advisor has been engaging in a pattern of transactions that, while not explicitly violating any single rule, collectively raise concerns about potential market manipulation. The firm's compliance department has identified these transactions through its surveillance systems. The advisor claims these are legitimate strategies to optimize client portfolios. The firm must decide how to proceed. Option A. Dismiss the advisor's explanation at face value and instruct the compliance department to close the matter without further inquiry, assuming the advisor is acting in good faith. Option B. Immediately report the advisor's transaction patterns to the relevant regulatory authority, citing the potential for market manipulation, without conducting a comprehensive internal investigation. Option C. Conduct a detailed internal review of the advisor's transaction history, client communications, and trading strategies, documenting all findings, and consult with legal counsel to determine if the pattern of activity constitutes a breach of regulatory requirements or ethical standards before any external reporting. Option D. Advise the advisor to cease all such transactions immediately and monitor their activity closely, but refrain from any further internal investigation or external reporting unless new, more direct evidence of wrongdoing emerges. The correct answer is C. Conduct a detailed internal review of the advisor's transaction history, client communications, and trading strategies, documenting all findings, and consult with legal counsel to determine if the pattern of activity constitutes a breach of regulatory requirements or ethical standards before any external reporting. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a firm's duty to protect client confidentiality and the regulatory obligation to report suspicious activities. The firm must navigate the delicate balance of gathering sufficient information to assess potential misconduct without breaching client trust or tipping off the client about an impending investigation. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with both legal and ethical standards. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, objective, and documented internal review before escalating to external regulatory bodies. This aligns with the principles of due diligence and responsible corporate conduct. By gathering evidence internally, the firm can make a more informed decision about the necessity and scope of any external reporting, thereby minimizing unnecessary disruption and potential reputational damage to the client if the suspicion proves unfounded. This methodical approach also ensures that any subsequent reporting is accurate and complete, fulfilling the firm's regulatory obligations effectively. An incorrect approach that involves immediate, unsubstantiated reporting to regulators without internal investigation would be professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a lack of due diligence and could lead to premature accusations, damaging the firm's reputation and potentially causing undue harm to the client. It also represents a failure to act in the client's best interest by not first attempting to understand the situation internally. Another incorrect approach, such as ignoring the red flags due to a desire to avoid conflict or potential loss of business, constitutes a direct breach of regulatory obligations and ethical duties. This inaction can have severe consequences, including regulatory penalties and a loss of public trust. A third incorrect approach, which involves a superficial internal review that fails to uncover critical information, demonstrates a lack of professional competence and a disregard for the seriousness of the potential misconduct. This can lead to inadequate reporting or a failure to report altogether, exposing the firm and its employees to significant risk. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework when faced with such situations. This framework typically involves 1. Identifying the potential issue and its implications. 2. Consulting relevant internal policies and procedures. 3. Gathering all available information objectively and thoroughly. 4. Assessing the information against regulatory requirements and ethical standards. 5. Documenting all steps taken and decisions made. 6. Seeking advice from legal counsel or compliance officers when necessary. 7. Determining the appropriate course of action, which may include further internal investigation, reporting to regulators, or taking no further action if the suspicion is unfounded. Question 9. Upon reviewing a client's portfolio, an advisor identifies that the client, who has a low risk tolerance and a short-term investment horizon, is requesting a significant reallocation into highly speculative, illiquid assets. The advisor believes this request is contrary to the client's stated financial goals and risk profile. What is the most appropriate course of action for the advisor? Option A. Explain to the client why the requested reallocation is not suitable given their risk tolerance and investment horizon. Outline the potential negative consequences, and propose alternative investment strategies that align with their stated objectives. Option B. Execute the client's requested reallocation immediately to ensure client satisfaction, assuming the client is fully aware of the risks involved. Option C. Advise the client that, while the requested reallocation is risky, it might offer significant returns, and proceed with the transaction after obtaining a signed waiver acknowledging the risks. Option D. Refuse to implement the reallocation without providing any explanation or alternative suggestions, citing internal policy. Correct answer is A. Explain to the client why the requested reallocation is not suitable given their risk tolerance and investment horizon. Outline the potential negative consequences, and propose alternative investment strategies that align with their stated objectives. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated wishes and the advisor's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, particularly when those wishes might lead to suboptimal outcomes or regulatory breaches. The advisor must navigate this by prioritizing regulatory compliance and ethical conduct over immediate client satisfaction if the client's request is not in their best interest or contravenes regulations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it upholds the advisor's fiduciary duty. This involves a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and objectives, followed by providing advice that is demonstrably in the client's best interest, even if it means explaining why the client's initial request cannot be fulfilled as stated. This aligns with the principles of suitability and client care mandated by regulatory frameworks, ensuring that advice is personalized and appropriate. An incorrect approach that prioritizes the client's immediate, potentially ill-advised request without sufficient due diligence fails to meet the standard of care. This could lead to regulatory sanctions for failing to act in the client's best interest, potentially resulting in financial harm to the client and reputational damage to the advisor. Another incorrect approach, which involves outright refusal without explanation or alternative suggestions, is unprofessional and fails to educate the client or explore viable solutions, thereby undermining the client relationship and potentially missing opportunities to serve the client effectively within regulatory bounds. A third incorrect approach, which involves misrepresenting the risks or benefits to accommodate the client's request, constitutes a serious ethical and regulatory breach, potentially leading to severe penalties and loss of license. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the client's stated needs, then rigorously assessing these needs against regulatory requirements and the advisor's fiduciary obligations. This involves open communication, educating the client about alternatives and consequences, and documenting all advice and client decisions. If a client's request is unfeasible or detrimental, the professional must clearly articulate the reasons, propose suitable alternatives, and ensure the client understands the implications of their final decision. Question 10. Stakeholder feedback indicates that a long-standing client, known for their complex international transactions, has recently engaged in a series of unusually large cash deposits followed by immediate wire transfers to a new, previously unassociated offshore entity. While the client has always been cooperative, these recent activities deviate significantly from their historical transaction patterns and raise concerns about potential money laundering. As a junior compliance officer, what is the most appropriate immediate course of action? Option A. Take no immediate action, assuming the client's past good standing means these are likely legitimate, albeit unusual, transactions. Option B. Discuss the suspicions with a trusted senior colleague in a different department to get their opinion on the matter. Option C. Escalate the concerns and all supporting documentation to the firm's Money Laundering Reporting Officer, MLRO, for review and further investigation according to internal procedures. Option D. Directly contact the client to inquire about the nature and purpose of these recent transactions to clarify the situation. Correct answer is C. Escalate the concerns and all supporting documentation to the firm's Money Laundering Reporting Officer, MLRO, for review and further investigation according to internal procedures. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between client confidentiality and the regulatory obligation to report suspicious activities. The firm's reputation, client trust, and potential legal repercussions are all at stake. Navigating this requires a nuanced understanding of the firm's internal policies, relevant anti-money laundering, AML regulations, and the ethical duty to both protect client information and uphold market integrity. The pressure to maintain client relationships must be balanced against the imperative to act responsibly. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves escalating the concern internally through the designated compliance channels. This aligns with best professional practice because it ensures that the matter is reviewed by individuals with the expertise and authority to assess the situation against regulatory requirements and internal policies. This process allows for a thorough investigation without prematurely breaching client confidentiality or making unsubstantiated accusations. It also provides a structured framework for determining if a suspicious activity report, SAR, is indeed warranted, thereby fulfilling the firm's regulatory obligations under the relevant AML legislation. This approach upholds both client trust by not immediately reporting without due diligence and regulatory compliance. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to directly confront the client with the suspicions. This is professionally unacceptable because it could tip off the client, potentially leading to the destruction of evidence or further illicit activity, thereby hindering any subsequent investigation. It also breaches client confidentiality without a proper regulatory basis and could damage the client relationship irreparably, even if the suspicions are unfounded. Furthermore, it bypasses the firm's established compliance procedures, which are designed to ensure consistent and compliant handling of such matters. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the feedback and take no action. This is a severe regulatory and ethical failure. It directly contravenes the firm's duty to identify and report suspicious transactions as mandated by AML regulations. By failing to act, the firm becomes complicit in potential money laundering or other financial crimes, exposing itself to significant penalties, reputational damage, and potential criminal liability. It also undermines the integrity of the financial system. A third incorrect approach is to discuss the suspicions with colleagues outside of the designated compliance function without a clear need to know. This constitutes a breach of client confidentiality and can lead to the spread of unsubstantiated rumors, damaging both the client's reputation and the firm's internal culture. It also circumvents the proper channels for investigating and reporting suspicious activity, potentially compromising the integrity of any future regulatory filings. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should follow a clear decision-making framework. First, they must recognize the potential red flags and understand the firm's internal policies and procedures for handling suspicious activity. Second, they should escalate the concern to the appropriate internal compliance or MLRO, Money Laundering Reporting Officer, without delay. Third, they must cooperate fully with the internal investigation, providing all relevant information. Fourth, they should refrain from discussing the matter with unauthorized individuals or directly confronting the client. Finally, they must trust the established compliance process to determine the appropriate course of action, whether that involves further investigation, no action, or filing a regulatory report. This structured approach ensures compliance, protects the firm, and upholds ethical standards. Question 11. Examination of the data shows that a long-term client, who has consistently expressed a desire for capital preservation and low volatility, has recently requested to invest a significant portion of their portfolio in a highly speculative, emerging market technology stock. The client states they have seen positive media coverage and believe this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Your review of the client's financial statements and risk tolerance questionnaire indicates a low capacity for risk and a strong preference for stable, income-generating investments. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Conduct a detailed discussion with the client to explain the risks associated with the requested investment, how it conflicts with their stated objectives and risk profile, and propose alternative investments that align better with their financial goals and risk tolerance. Option B. Inform the client that their request is unsuitable and proceed to invest their funds in a diversified portfolio of government bonds, as this is what you believe is best for them. Option C. Immediately execute the client's requested trade, as the client has the ultimate authority to direct their investments. Option D. Proceed with the investment as requested by the client, as their stated desire for this specific opportunity overrides their previous risk tolerance assessments. The correct answer is A. Conduct a detailed discussion with the client to explain the risks associated with the requested investment, how it conflicts with their stated objectives and risk profile, and propose alternative investments that align better with their financial goals and risk tolerance. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in financial advisory, where a client's stated investment objective conflicts with their risk tolerance and financial situation. The professional must navigate this discrepancy by prioritizing the client's best interests and adhering to regulatory requirements for suitability, rather than simply executing the client's initial request. The challenge lies in balancing client autonomy with the advisor's fiduciary duty and regulatory obligations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough reevaluation of the client's financial situation and risk profile, followed by an educational discussion with the client. This aligns with the regulatory framework's emphasis on suitability, which mandates that recommendations must be appropriate for the client's investment objectives, financial situation, and risk tolerance. By explaining the risks associated with the requested investment and proposing alternatives that better match the client's profile, the advisor upholds their fiduciary duty and regulatory compliance. This demonstrates a commitment to client welfare over immediate transaction completion. Incorrect approach is analysis. Proceeding with the client's initial request without further assessment ignores the fundamental principle of suitability. This is a direct regulatory failure, as it could lead to an investment that is not appropriate for the client, potentially causing financial harm and violating the duty to act in the client's best interest. Ethically, it prioritizes expediency over client protection, focusing solely on the client's stated preference without considering their risk tolerance or financial capacity is also a regulatory and ethical lapse. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to adequately assess the client's circumstances, which are core requirements for providing suitable advice. Ignoring the client's request and unilaterally making a different recommendation without explanation or client agreement is unprofessional. While the intention might be to protect the client, it undermines client autonomy and the collaborative nature of financial planning. It also fails to adequately address the client's initial stated objective, even if it was deemed unsuitable. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with understanding the client's stated objectives. This must be followed by a comprehensive assessment of their financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment knowledge. Any discrepancies between the stated objectives and the assessed profile should be addressed through open communication and education. The advisor's role is to guide the client towards suitable investment decisions that align with their overall financial well-being, even if it means challenging or modifying their initial requests. This process ensures compliance with suitability rules and fosters trust and long-term client relationships. Question 12. Performance analysis shows that a client who has expressed a strong desire for capital growth and has limited experience with complex financial instruments is considering a structured product with a leveraged upside but also significant downside risk. The advisor has explained the product's mechanics, but the client seems to be focusing only on the potential for high returns and has not fully grasped the implications of the capital at risk. The firm's internal compliance policy mandates that advisors must ensure clients fully understand the risks and suitability of any product before proceeding with a recommendation. Which of the following actions best represent the advisor's professional and regulatory obligations in this situation? Option A. Proceed with the recommendation, emphasizing the potential for high returns to align with the client's stated objective, and assume the client will seek further clarification if needed. Option B. Recommend the product, but advise the client to seek independent financial advice to confirm their understanding of the risks, thereby shifting the primary responsibility for ensuring comprehension. Option C. Reiterate the potential for high returns, but briefly mention that there are some risks involved without elaborating further, to avoid overwhelming the client and potentially losing the sale. Option D. Decline to recommend the structured product at this time. Explain to the client that it may not be suitable given their current level of understanding and risk tolerance, and explore alternative, simpler investment options that better match their profile. The correct answer is A. Proceed with the recommendation, emphasizing the potential for high returns to align with the client's stated objective, and assume the client will seek further clarification if needed. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing client interests with regulatory obligations, specifically concerning the duty of care and the prohibition against misleading information. The advisor must interpret complex product features and communicate them accurately to a client with limited financial literacy, while also adhering to the firm's compliance policies. The pressure to secure a sale, coupled with the client's expressed desire for a specific outcome, creates a conflict that demands careful ethical and regulatory navigation. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing the client's understanding and suitability of the product over immediate sales. This aligns with the regulatory framework's emphasis on acting in the client's best interests and ensuring that advice is suitable. Specifically, it upholds the duty of care by taking the necessary steps to confirm the client comprehends the risks and features, and it avoids misleading the client by presenting a realistic, rather than overly optimistic, picture of the product's performance and limitations. This approach also reflects a commitment to ethical conduct by fostering transparency and informed consent. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach fails by proceeding with the sale without adequate confirmation of the client's understanding. This constitutes a breach of the duty of care, as the advisor has not taken reasonable steps to ensure the client is making an informed decision. It also risks misleading the client by implying the product is suitable when its complexities may not have been grasped, potentially leading to future dissatisfaction and regulatory scrutiny for mis-selling. Another incorrect approach fails by downplaying the risks and focusing solely on the potential upside to secure the sale. This is a direct violation of the regulatory requirement to provide balanced and accurate information. It is misleading and unethical, as it prioritizes the advisor's or firm's interests, commission, sales targets over the client's well-being and the suitability of the investment. This could lead to significant client detriment and regulatory sanctions. A third incorrect approach fails by assuming the client's understanding based on their stated desire for a particular outcome. This is a failure to exercise professional judgment and diligence. The client's expressed preference does not absolve the advisor of the responsibility to ensure comprehension and suitability. This approach risks proceeding with an unsuitable investment, breaching the duty of care, and potentially leading to regulatory action for inadequate client assessment. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that begins with a thorough assessment of the client's needs, objectives, and understanding. This involves active listening, clear communication, and verification of comprehension. When faced with complex products or clients with limited knowledge, the professional must err on the side of caution, dedicating extra time to explanation and ensuring suitability. The regulatory framework and ethical principles should guide every step, prioritizing client protection and informed decision-making above all else. If there is any doubt about suitability or understanding, the professional should refrain from proceeding and explore alternative solutions or provide further education. Question 13. The efficiency study reveals that the firm's current client onboarding process is time-consuming and prone to manual errors. Management is eager to implement a new, cloud-based software solution that promises to streamline operations and reduce processing time significantly. However, the IT department has raised concerns about the security protocols of the proposed software and the potential impact on client data privacy. The project timeline is aggressive, with a target go-live date within the next quarter. Which of the following represents the most professionally responsible course of action? Option A. Authorize the IT department to proceed with the implementation, instructing them to implement additional security layers on top of the vendor's existing protocols without a full vendor audit. Option B. Proceed with the implementation of the new software as planned, with a commitment to address any security or privacy issues that arise post-launch. Option C. Implement the new software but restrict its use to non-sensitive client data initially, with a plan to migrate all data once further assurances on security are obtained. Option D. Delay the implementation until a comprehensive security audit of the proposed software and its vendor has been completed, and all identified vulnerabilities have been remediated. The correct answer is B. Proceed with the implementation of the new software as planned, with a commitment to address any security or privacy issues that arise post-launch. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between the desire for operational efficiency and the paramount importance of client confidentiality and data integrity, as mandated by regulatory frameworks governing financial services. The pressure to implement a new system quickly, while potentially beneficial for the firm, must be balanced against the risks of data breaches, unauthorized access, and noncompliance with data protection laws. Careful judgment is required to ensure that efficiency gains do not come at the expense of client trust and legal obligations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough risk assessment and a phased implementation strategy. This aligns with regulatory expectations for robust data security and client protection. Specifically, it adheres to principles of data minimization, purpose limitation, and security by design, ensuring that any new system is evaluated for its impact on client data and that appropriate safeguards are in place before deployment. This proactive stance minimizes the likelihood of regulatory breaches and reputational damage. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on rapid deployment without adequate testing or security protocols would fail to meet the standards of due diligence required by financial regulators. This could lead to breaches of data privacy laws, such as those requiring secure handling of personal and financial information, and potentially violate client agreements regarding data confidentiality. Another incorrect approach, which involves bypassing established IT security review processes, directly contravenes internal policies and external regulations designed to prevent unauthorized access and data manipulation. This demonstrates a disregard for risk management and could expose the firm to significant financial penalties and legal liabilities. A third incorrect approach, which involves migrating sensitive client data to a new system without verifying the vendor's compliance with data protection standards, represents a failure in third-party risk management, a critical area of regulatory scrutiny. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying potential risks and regulatory implications. This involves consulting relevant compliance officers and legal counsel. The next step is to evaluate proposed solutions against these identified risks and regulatory requirements, prioritizing approaches that demonstrate a clear commitment to data security, client confidentiality, and compliance. A phased implementation with pilot testing and ongoing monitoring is generally preferred over rapid, untested deployment. Finally, ensuring that all third-party vendors meet stringent data protection standards is a non-negotiable prerequisite for engaging their services. Question 14. Analysis of a financial advisor's ethical and regulatory dilemma when a long-standing client, involved in international trade, suddenly begins conducting a series of complex, high-value transactions through their account that appear to lack clear commercial rationale and involve jurisdictions known for higher money laundering risks. The advisor has a duty of confidentiality to the client, but also a statutory obligation to report suspicious activities. What is the most appropriate initial course of action for the advisor? Option A. Continue to process the transactions as usual, assuming the client is acting within legal bounds, and address any concerns only if explicitly asked by regulators. Option B. Discreetly gather additional information and consult with the firm's money laundering reporting officer, MLRO, to assess the situation further before taking any action. Option C. Immediately file a suspicious activity report, SAR, with the relevant authorities, detailing all observed transactions. Option D. Directly question the client about the nature and purpose of these unusual transactions to gain clarity. The correct answer is B. Discreetly gather additional information and consult with the firm's money laundering reporting officer, MLRO, to assess the situation further before taking any action. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between client confidentiality and the regulatory obligation to report suspicious activities. The advisor must navigate the delicate balance of maintaining trust with their client while adhering to legal and ethical mandates designed to prevent financial crime. Failure to act appropriately can lead to severe reputational damage, regulatory sanctions, and personal liability. The advisor's judgment is critical in discerning when a client's actions cross the threshold from unusual to potentially illicit. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves discreetly gathering further information to confirm suspicions without alerting the client prematurely. This aligns with the regulatory framework's emphasis on a risk-based approach to anti-money laundering (AML) and counter-terrorist financing (CTF). By seeking clarification and corroborating evidence, the advisor can make a more informed decision about whether a suspicious activity report (SAR) is warranted. This process respects client privacy as much as possible while fulfilling the duty to report. The regulatory framework, such as the Proceeds of Crime Act 2002, (POCA), and the Terrorism Act 2000 in the UK, mandates reporting where there is knowledge or suspicion of money laundering or terrorist financing. This approach prioritizes compliance with these reporting obligations once a reasonable suspicion is formed. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately filing a SAR without further investigation. This could be premature and potentially damage the client relationship unnecessarily if the suspicions are unfounded. It also risks tipping off the client, which is a criminal offense under POCA. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the suspicions and take no action. This is a direct violation of AML/CTF regulations, as it fails to fulfill the statutory duty to report. This inaction can lead to significant penalties for both the individual and the firm, as well as potentially facilitating criminal activity. A third incorrect approach is to discuss the suspicions with the client directly to seek an explanation. This constitutes tipping off and is a serious offense, undermining the integrity of the reporting system and potentially allowing criminals to conceal their activities. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process when faced with potential suspicious activity. This involves 1. Initial assessment. Recognize and document any unusual or potentially suspicious client behavior or transactions. 2. Information gathering. Discreetly seek further information or clarification from internal sources or publicly available data to corroborate or refute suspicions. Avoid direct client questioning that could constitute tipping off. 3. Internal consultation. If suspicions persist, consult with the firm's compliance officer or MLRO, money laundering reporting officer, for guidance and to ensure adherence to internal policies and procedures. 4. Reporting decision. Based on the gathered information and consultation, make a reasoned decision on whether to file a SAR. If a SAR is filed, ensure it is done promptly and accurately. 5. Documentation. Maintain thorough records of all assessments, investigations, consultations, and decisions made throughout the process. Question 15. The control framework reveals a pattern of unusual trading activity by a significant client shortly before a major corporate announcement. The compliance officer has received an alert from the firm's surveillance system, but the client is a long-standing and reputable entity. The compliance officer must decide on the immediate next steps. Option A. Immediately report the suspicious trading activity to the relevant regulatory authority, citing the alert from the surveillance system. Option B. Dismiss the alert as a false positive, given the client's strong reputation and the potential for reputational damage if the suspicion is unfounded. Option C. Initiate a discreet internal review to gather all relevant information and context surrounding the trading activity and the client's announcement before considering any external reporting. Option D. Contact the client directly to inquire about their trading intentions and the reasons for the recent transactions. The correct answer is C. Initiate a discreet internal review to gather all relevant information and context surrounding the trading activity and the client's announcement before considering any external reporting. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a challenge in balancing client confidentiality with the firm's internal risk management obligations. The compliance officer must navigate the potential for a conflict of interest and the need to escalate concerns without prejudicing the client's legitimate business activities or breaching professional duties. The firm's reputation and regulatory standing are at stake, requiring a measured and informed response. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing a thorough, objective investigation before making any definitive conclusions or taking drastic action. This aligns with the principles of due diligence and fair process. Specifically, it adheres to regulatory expectations that firms have robust internal controls to identify and manage risks, including those related to potential market abuse or insider dealing. By seeking to understand the full context and gathering all relevant information, the compliance officer acts ethically and professionally, fulfilling their duty to both the firm and the regulatory environment. This approach respects the presumption of innocence while diligently upholding compliance standards. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediate reporting to the regulator without a preliminary internal investigation. This is a regulatory failure as it bypasses the firm's internal control mechanisms and may lead to unnecessary regulatory scrutiny or action based on incomplete information. It also breaches the ethical duty to act with proportionality and fairness. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the concern outright due to the client's reputation. This is an ethical failure and a potential regulatory breach. It demonstrates a lack of diligence and a failure to apply the control framework consistently, potentially exposing the firm to significant risk if the initial concern was indeed valid. It prioritizes expediency over robust risk management. A third incorrect approach is to confront the client directly with the suspicion without having gathered sufficient evidence or understanding the full context. This could prejudice any subsequent investigation, alert potential wrongdoers, and damage the client relationship unnecessarily if the suspicion proves unfounded. It represents a failure in professional judgment and a potential breach of confidentiality if handled improperly. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should employ a structured decision-making process. This involves 1. Acknowledging and documenting the initial concern. 2. Initiating a confidential, objective internal investigation to gather facts and context. 3. Consulting relevant internal policies and regulatory guidance. 4. Assessing the findings against established risk thresholds. 5. Determining the appropriate escalation path, which may involve further internal review, seeking legal counsel, or reporting to the regulator based on the evidence. This systematic approach ensures that actions are proportionate, justifiable, and compliant with both regulatory requirements and ethical standards. Question 16. The efficiency study reveals that the firm's current client onboarding process for new investment accounts is taking longer than industry benchmarks, leading to increased operational costs. To address this, management is considering several proposals to streamline the process. One proposal suggests reducing the depth of client fact-finding for clients with less than £50,000 in investable assets, focusing only on basic risk tolerance and financial goals. Another suggests implementing a fully automated, algorithm-driven suitability assessment for all clients, with minimal human advisor intervention. A third proposal advocates for a tiered approach, where a more comprehensive fact-finding process is maintained for clients with over £50,000, while a simplified, standardized process is used for those below this threshold, with advisors encouraged to expedite interactions. Which of the following approaches best balances efficiency gains with the firm's regulatory and ethical obligations to provide suitable investment advice? Option A. Maintain the current, more time-consuming onboarding process for all clients to ensure that no aspect of suitability is overlooked, even if it impacts operational efficiency. Option B. Implement a fully automated, algorithm-driven suitability assessment for all clients, with minimal human advisor intervention to achieve maximum efficiency. Option C. Reduce the depth of client fact-finding for clients with less than £50,000 in investable assets, focusing only on basic risk tolerance and financial goals to significantly speed up the onboarding process. Option D. Implement a tiered approach where a comprehensive fact-finding process is maintained for clients with over £50,000, while a simplified, standardized process is used for those below this threshold, with advisors encouraged to expedite interactions, provided that the simplified process still captures essential suitability information and allows for advisor discretion in complex cases. The correct answer is D. Implement a tiered approach where a comprehensive fact-finding process is maintained for clients with over £50,000, while a simplified, standardized process is used for those below this threshold, with advisors encouraged to expedite interactions, provided that the simplified process still captures essential suitability information and allows for advisor discretion in complex cases. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the pursuit of operational efficiency with the fundamental duty of care owed to clients and the integrity of financial advice. The pressure to reduce costs by streamlining processes, while understandable from a business perspective, must not compromise the quality or suitability of the advice provided. Professionals are bound by regulatory obligation to act in their clients' best interests and to ensure that recommendations are appropriate to their individual circumstances. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes client outcomes and regulatory compliance. By implementing a robust, albeit more resource-intensive, review process for complex client needs, the firm demonstrates a commitment to upholding its fiduciary duties. This aligns with regulatory expectations that firms should have adequate systems and controls in place to manage risks and ensure that advice is suitable. The emphasis on ongoing training and the establishment of clear escalation procedures for complex cases further reinforce this commitment, ensuring that staff possess the necessary skills and knowledge to meet client needs effectively and ethically. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on cost reduction without considering the impact on client suitability would fail to meet regulatory standards. For instance, implementing a blanket policy to limit the scope of advice for certain client segments to reduce advisor time would likely breach the duty to provide suitable recommendations, as individual client needs may not be adequately addressed. This could lead to regulatory sanctions for failing to act in clients' best interests. Another incorrect approach, such as relying on automated advice generation without sufficient human oversight for complex cases, risks providing generic or inappropriate recommendations, thereby failing to meet the client's specific circumstances and potentially violating suitability rules. This also overlooks the ethical imperative to provide personalized and informed advice. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying all relevant regulatory obligations and ethical principles. This should be followed by an assessment of the potential impact of any proposed change on client outcomes and regulatory compliance. When considering efficiency measures, the primary consideration must always be whether these measures will compromise the firm's ability to meet its duties to clients. If a proposed efficiency measure risks such a compromise, it must be modified or rejected. A structured approach involving risk assessment, scenario planning, and consultation with compliance and legal departments is crucial before implementing any significant operational changes. Question 17. Research into the regulatory framework for the target hiring assessment test reveals a strong emphasis on maintaining a level playing field for all candidates. Considering this, what is the most appropriate method for a firm to engage with potential candidates regarding the assessment without violating these principles? Option A. Providing general guidance on the types of skills and knowledge areas that are typically assessed, drawing from publicly available industry standards and best practices. Option B. Offering personalized coaching sessions that focus on identifying and exploiting perceived weaknesses in the assessment's design. Option C. Sharing specific examples of past assessment questions and detailed strategies for answering them based on internal analysis of previous test results. Option D. Disclosing the weighting and scoring mechanisms for each section of the assessment to help candidates prioritize their preparation. The correct answer is A. Providing general guidance on the types of skills and knowledge areas that are typically assessed, drawing from publicly available industry standards and best practices. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a firm's desire to attract new business and the stringent regulatory requirements designed to prevent market manipulation and ensure fair dealing. The challenge lies in balancing proactive client engagement with the need for absolute adherence to the target hiring assessment test's specified regulatory framework, which likely emphasizes principles of integrity, transparency, and avoiding any actions that could be construed as providing unfair advantages or misleading information. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any outreach or information sharing is conducted in a manner that is compliant, ethical, and does not create an uneven playing field for other potential candidates or market participants. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to the regulatory framework and ethical conduct above all else. By focusing on publicly available information and general industry insights, it avoids any suggestion of preferential treatment or the disclosure of non-public information that could influence a candidate's assessment performance or create an unfair advantage. This aligns with the regulatory imperative to maintain market integrity and ensure that all candidates are assessed on a level playing field, based on their own merits and preparation, rather than on information gained through privileged channels. An incorrect approach that involves sharing specific insights or strategies derived from internal knowledge of the assessment's design or past performance would represent a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This could be construed as providing an unfair advantage, potentially violating rules against market manipulation or insider dealing if the assessment is considered a form of market. It undermines the validity of the assessment process and erodes trust in the firm's commitment to fair practices. Another incorrect approach, such as offering personalized coaching based on proprietary assessment data, would similarly breach ethical boundaries and regulatory guidelines by creating a two-tiered system where only certain individuals benefit from privileged information, thereby compromising the integrity of the hiring process. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the applicable regulatory framework and ethical codes. When faced with a situation that could potentially blur the lines of compliance, the first step is to identify the specific regulations and ethical principles at play. The next step is to assess the potential risks associated with different courses of action, considering how each might be perceived by regulators and other stakeholders. A conservative approach, prioritizing strict adherence to the letter and spirit of the regulations, is generally the safest and most ethical. If there is any doubt about the permissibility of an action, seeking guidance from compliance departments or legal counsel is essential. The ultimate goal is to ensure that all actions are transparent, fair, and demonstrably compliant with the established rules. Question 18. Governance review demonstrates that a new prospective client has provided documentation that appears to be legitimate, but raises several minor inconsistencies regarding the source of their substantial initial deposit. These inconsistencies, while not immediately indicative of outright fraud, deviate from the typical patterns observed for clients in their stated industry. The employee responsible for onboarding is under pressure to meet departmental targets for new client acquisition. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Directly question the prospective client about the source of the deposit to clarify the inconsistencies before proceeding with onboarding. Option B. Dismiss the inconsistencies as insignificant, as the documentation appears otherwise valid, and complete the onboarding process without further scrutiny. Option C. Escalate the identified inconsistencies and potential red flags to the firm's compliance department for further investigation and guidance. Option D. Proceed with onboarding the client, assuming the inconsistencies are minor and unlikely to pose a significant risk to meet client acquisition targets. Correct answer is C. Escalate the identified inconsistencies and potential red flags to the firm's compliance department for further investigation and guidance. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a firm's desire to expand its client base and the regulatory imperative to conduct thorough due diligence. The pressure to onboard new clients quickly, especially in a competitive market, can lead to shortcuts that compromise compliance. The challenge lies in balancing business objectives with the non-negotiable requirements of regulatory frameworks designed to prevent financial crime and protect the integrity of the financial system. This requires a nuanced understanding of risk assessment and the ability to make informed judgments about when to proceed and when to escalate or decline business. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach, which involves escalating the identified red flags to the compliance department for further investigation, represents best professional practice because it adheres strictly to the firm's anti-money laundering AML and Know Your Customer (KIC) policies. These policies are mandated by regulatory bodies to ensure that financial institutions do not inadvertently facilitate illicit activities. By flagging the concerns, the employee is fulfilling their duty to report suspicious activity, allowing the compliance team to conduct a more in-depth risk assessment, which may include enhanced due diligence measures or even refusal of the client. This proactive reporting is crucial for maintaining regulatory compliance and upholding ethical standards. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to proceed with onboarding the client without further investigation, assuming the information provided is sufficient. This represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It directly contravenes AML/KYC regulations that require robust due diligence, especially when red flags are present. Ethically, it demonstrates a disregard for the firm's responsibility to prevent financial crime and could expose the firm to severe penalties, reputational damage, and legal repercussions. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the red flags as minor issues that do not warrant significant attention, and to proceed with standard onboarding. This is also a regulatory and ethical failure. It signifies a lack of understanding or willful ignorance of the potential risks associated with the identified red flags. Regulatory frameworks are designed to address even seemingly minor deviations from expected norms, as these can be indicators of more serious underlying issues. Failing to investigate further is a breach of the firm's compliance obligations. A third incorrect approach is to consult with the prospective client directly about the red flags to seek clarification without involving the compliance department. This is a critical regulatory and ethical failure. It risks tipping off the prospective client about the firm's suspicions, potentially allowing them to alter their behavior or destroy evidence, thereby hindering any subsequent investigation. It also bypasses the established internal procedures for handling suspicious activity, undermining the firm's control environment and its ability to comply with regulatory reporting requirements. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should follow a structured decision-making process. First, they must thoroughly understand the firm's internal policies and procedures related to client onboarding, AML, and KIC. Second, should identify and document any red flags or inconsistencies observed during the due diligence process. Third, they must assess the potential risks associated with these red flags based on regulatory guidance and internal risk appetite. Fourth, if red flags are identified and the risk assessment indicates potential noncompliance or heightened risk, the professional's immediate action should be to escalate the matter to the designated compliance or legal department, following the firm's established reporting channels. This ensures that the situation is handled by individuals with the expertise and authority to conduct further investigation and make appropriate decisions, thereby safeguarding the firm and upholding regulatory and ethical standards. Question 19. The audit findings indicate that the firm's client onboarding process for new investment accounts has been expedited to meet business growth targets, with a particular focus on clients in the technology and real estate sectors. While basic identity verification is being conducted, the process for assessing the source of funds and wealth for these clients is inconsistent, with some clients undergoing more detailed scrutiny than others based on subjective assessments of their profession. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory requirements and professional best practice for client onboarding in this scenario? Option A. Implement a standardized, risk-based Know Your Customer KIC, an anti-money laundering AML procedure that mandates verification of the source of funds and wealth for all new clients, with enhanced due diligence applied based on objective risk factors, regardless of sector or stated profession. Option B. Delegate the entire KYC/AML verification process to a newly formed compliance team, trusting their judgment to identify and flag any potential issues without requiring senior oversight or specific training on source of funds verification. Option C. Continue with the current expedited process, relying on client declarations and basic identity checks, assuming that clients in the technology and real estate sectors are inherently low risk for money laundering. Option D. Focus enhanced due diligence efforts solely on clients who explicitly declare large or unusual transactions, and for all other clients, rely primarily on publicly available information and their stated profession. The correct answer is A. Implement a standardized, risk-based Know Your Customer KIC, an anti-money laundering procedure that mandates verification of the source of funds and wealth for all new clients, with enhanced due diligence applied based on objective risk factors, regardless of sector or stated profession. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a firm's desire to expand its client base and the regulatory imperative to conduct thorough due diligence. The pressure to onboard new clients quickly, especially in a competitive market, can lead to shortcuts that compromise regulatory compliance. The challenge lies in balancing business objectives with the non-negotiable requirements of regulatory frameworks designed to prevent financial crime and protect market integrity. Careful judgment is required to identify and mitigate risks associated with inadequate client onboarding. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach, which involves a robust Know Your Customer (KIC) and anti-money laundering (AML) process that includes verifying the source of funds and wealth for all new clients, represents best professional practice. This aligns directly with the principles of regulatory compliance, specifically the Money Laundering Regulations (MLR) in the UK. These regulations mandate that firms take reasonable steps to identify their customers and understand the nature of their business to prevent money laundering and terrorist financing. Verifying the source of funds and wealth is a critical component of this due diligence, as it helps to assess the risk associated with a client and identify any potentially illicit activities. This proactive approach demonstrates a commitment to upholding legal and ethical standards, safeguarding the firm's reputation, and contributing to the broader fight against financial crime. Incorrect approach is analysis, an approach that prioritizes speed of onboarding over thorough due diligence by only performing basic identity checks and not investigating the source of funds for clients deemed low risk based on their stated profession, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This is a direct contravention of the MLRs, which require a risk-based approach that still necessitates understanding the source of funds and wealth, even for low-risk clients. The assumption of low risk based solely on profession is insufficient and can lead to the onboarding of individuals involved in illicit activities. Another incorrect approach, which involves relying solely on publicly available information and client declarations without independent verification of the source of funds and wealth, also constitutes a regulatory and ethical failure. Publicly available information can be misleading or incomplete, and client declarations are not a substitute for due diligence. The MLRs require firms to take reasonable steps to verify information provided by clients, especially concerning the origin of their financial resources. Failure to do so exposes the firm to significant risks and undermines the effectiveness of AML controls. Finally, an approach that delegates the entire KYC/AML process to junior staff without adequate training, supervision, or clear escalation procedures for suspicious findings is professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a lack of commitment to regulatory compliance at a senior level and creates a high risk of errors and omissions. Junior staff may lack the experience or knowledge to identify red flags, and without proper oversight, these issues are unlikely to be detected or addressed, leading to potential breaches of the MLRs and ethical misconduct. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based approach to client onboarding, guided by regulatory requirements such as the UK's MLRs. This involves a structured process that includes robust identity verification, understanding the nature and purpose of the business relationship, and critically, assessing the source of funds and wealth. When faced with pressure to expedite onboarding, professionals must prioritize compliance. This requires clear internal policies and procedures, adequate training for all staff involved, and a culture that emphasizes ethical conduct and regulatory adherence. If a client's profile or the circumstances of their onboarding raise any concerns, even if they appear low risk, further investigation is warranted. Escalation procedures should be in place to ensure complex or high-risk cases are reviewed by experienced personnel. The ultimate decision to onboard a client should be based on a comprehensive risk assessment that satisfies regulatory obligations, rather than on commercial expediency. Question 20. Which approach would be most appropriate for a financial advisor who discovers a potential conflict of interest when a new client proposes a transaction that could benefit the advisor's personal investment portfolio, but also aligns with the client's stated investment objectives? Option A. Immediately halt discussions regarding the transaction and consult with the firm's compliance department to assess the conflict and determine appropriate disclosure and mitigation strategies. Option B. Proceed with the transaction after confirming it aligns with the client's stated objectives, assuming the client is sophisticated enough to understand the potential for personal benefit to the advisor. Option C. Inform the client of the potential conflict and proceed with the transaction if the client explicitly waives any objection without further internal consultation. Option D. Discreetly execute the transaction in a way that minimizes the appearance of a conflict, focusing on achieving the client's stated objectives. The correct answer is B. Proceed with the transaction after confirming it aligns with the client's stated objectives, assuming the client is sophisticated enough to understand the potential for personal benefit to the advisor. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the firm's commercial interests with its fundamental regulatory obligations. The pressure to secure new business can lead to overlooking or downplaying potential conflicts of interest, which are a significant focus of regulatory oversight. Careful judgment is required to ensure that client interests are always prioritized and that all disclosures are made in a timely and transparent manner, as mandated by regulatory frameworks designed to prevent market abuse and protect investors. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the regulatory requirement for proactive identification and management of conflicts of interest. By seeking guidance from the compliance department and documenting the process, the individual demonstrates adherence to established procedures designed to uphold regulatory standards. This proactive stance ensures that any potential conflicts are assessed against the relevant rules, such as those pertaining to client asset protection and fair dealing, thereby safeguarding both the client and the firm from regulatory breaches and reputational damage. This aligns with the principles of integrity and due diligence expected of all regulated professionals. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding without full disclosure and internal consultation would represent a failure to comply with the firm's internal policies and, more importantly, with regulatory mandates concerning conflicts of interest. Such a failure could lead to breaches of rules requiring fair treatment of clients and the avoidance of situations where personal interests could improperly influence professional judgment. Another incorrect approach, such as attempting to resolve the conflict independently without involving compliance, risks misinterpreting the severity of the conflict or applying inappropriate mitigation strategies, thereby exposing the firm and the client to significant regulatory and ethical risks. This bypasses the established governance structures designed to ensure robust compliance. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory adherence and ethical conduct. This involves first identifying potential conflicts, then consulting internal compliance and legal departments for guidance, thoroughly documenting all assessments and decisions, and ensuring all necessary disclosures are made to affected parties. If a conflict cannot be adequately managed or mitigated, the professional should escalate the issue and be prepared to decline the business opportunity to uphold their fiduciary duties and regulatory obligations.